despite all the wackiness happening in the world. There are still other things happening, but I am going to focus once again on the supposed ceasefire happening between Israel and the Hamas today. So it turns out that in the first 15 minutes of the ceasefire, sirens were blaring. By sirens, I mean sirens that go off in Israel whenever rockets are fired towards Israel. And in this case, there were rockets being fired from Gaza into Israel yet again, right at the start of the ceasefire. Who exactly fired the rockets? Maybe it was Hamas, maybe it was some other violent group, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or any of the other groups that are based in Gaza. But the fact is, they fired rockets right at the outset of the ceasefire, or the pause in the fighting, whatever you want to call it. The supposed 4-day pause in the fighting started off with a bang. Quite literally. And on top of that, you then had a group of people from Gaza who were originally who are from North Gaza, that's where they live, but who have moved since the start of the war to South Gaza in order to avoid being caught up in the fighting. And they decided to move, to walk back towards their homes in North Gaza, even if they don't know that their homes are, in a condition to move back to, necessarily. Nevertheless, some of them tried, and they were stopped in their tracks by anti-riot measures taken by the Israeli police, or not police, soldiers. The IDF used anti-riot gear to disperse those marching northward, and this, of course, didn't, hopefully, from the reports, did not lead to any gunfire, but it was a disruption in the pause of the war, in a sense, although that nobody was shot or anything like that, as far as I can tell from all the news reports that I've seen. Nevertheless, there were people trying to go back towards their homes in the north of Gaza, and why they would do that during the middle of a war, even though there's a 4-day pause on, is quite obvious, right? They want as many people to go back as possible, the Hamas does, so that it'll be harder for Israel to start fighting again. Because if you suddenly have 100,000, 200,000, 300,000, 500,000 people, and then, however many they manage to move into there at the end of 4 days, will Israel once again evacuate the north of Gaza? Strategically, that may be a challenge to do. However, actually, you have to look at the longer term and think, well, what is Israel going to do if this fighting starts again and they decide, whenever they decide to move more into the south end of Gaza to fight the remaining Hamas people there? Are they going to evacuate people from the south to the north? What is the plan, right? Until that plan is known, it's a matter of some doubt. It certainly leaves many questions unanswered for the time being. So, what is the potential solution to this situation? Well, Israel is in the start of this 4-day fighting. Meanwhile, Hezbollah is not part of this thing. So, for all intents and purposes, Lebanon and Israel is not necessarily going to see any kind of pause in fighting, back and forth, throwing missiles, one of each each other, or attacking each other. And that does not bode well for people who want to see an end in the fighting, because it just doesn't. But now, the question of, is the pause good or bad? Right? Is the prisoner and hostage swap good or bad? And in many cases, this will depend on who you ask in terms of the answer you get. The way that I see it, for what it's worth, is that, of course, hostage families, as I explained in the previous video, want to see their families returned. And of course, people who have family in prison in Israel, even if they've been convicted through a judicial process, they want to see their families released too. As wrong as it may be to release terrorists, which we have seen happen before. Right? As I mentioned in the previous video, 1,000 Palestinian prisoners were released just for Gilad Shalit to come home. And among those prisoners was Yahya Sinwar, the man who now leads Hamas in Gaza, and who's directly responsible for leading the attack, or commanding the attack that happened on October 7th. So is it good to do a hostage prisoner swap? And is it good to release more prisoners than hostages you're getting back, when those prisoners have, by and large, been convicted through a judicial process? And even those that haven't been were arrested on suspicion of being involved in or supporting acts of terror. Right? Well, and they're still involved in a legal process. And, people say, well, they haven't seen lawyers, it's not really illegal. It's a legal process. Can it take an undue or a prolonged amount of time? Yes, it does. And it's not a good thing, but that's the way it goes. When you have so many cases to deal with, judicial systems get backed up. This is a known problem throughout countries around the world. Nevertheless, those prisoners are treated humanely in Israeli prisons, at least by the Israeli prison guards and prison system. They may not be treated humanely by their own factions of, people in the prisons. It's widely known at this point. If you don't know, you should do some research, that the Hamas is very much a thing in Israeli prisons, and that they abuse and torture and even kill their own members who they suspect of, turning and being agents for Israel, or confessing to things and helping the Israelis figure out how to stop the next Hamas attack, etc., etc. So those people are treated, by the Israeli prison system anyway, better than they're treated by their own supposed brethren in arms of the Hamas and other groups in Israeli prisons. So the question is it right to release 150 of these prisoners and have a 4-day pause in the fighting in exchange for 50 Israelis who've been taken hostage, not for committing any crimes, but just for being alive in Israel? And the answer is very complicated for a lot of reasons, but I will, refer to what many people will know as deterrence. And deterrence, right, says that if you want to stop the potential of future attacks, and if you want to stop the potential of future hostage taking, then you don't negotiate with hostage takers, right? You destroy them. go after them relentlessly, even if you know that the cost may be that some of the hostages' lives, or maybe many, or most, or all of them may be ended by the hostage takers, the terrorists. Because the lesson is that you don't negotiate with terrorists, right? You go after them, and you make them surrender, and you force them to give up the hostages, or you take the hostages any way necessary back to freedom, and back to their homes, back to their families and loved ones. And those who perish, will be duly buried and mourned and all of that. Of course, that's easier for anybody who doesn't have family that is currently a captive to say than anybody who does. But it is also the case that throughout history, and even recently, the Jewish people have done just that. In fact, even the current Prime Minister of Israel, who I do not exactly praise for his management of the country, especially during this conflict, he himself wrote a book many years ago about how the only way to really win this war defeat terrorists is to use force. And not a proportional amount, but to use overwhelming force so that you deter the desire of the terrorists to repeat their actions in the future. And the problem is that by not doing that, you are in fact telling the bad guys, hey, this worked for you. You were able to get a bigger force than you to basically raise a white flag, even though you attacked them, and even though you did all the initial acts of violence which led to this war, and you were able to get more out of them than they got out of you. And that is the problem, right? Rewarding the enemy that attacks you unduly is not a good solution if you're seeking peace and if you want, ultimately, the violence to stop. But as I've said many times, the current government of Israel is led by people who have an interest in prolonging this war as long as possible, especially the Prime Minister, who knows that if he ends the war today, he'll probably be out of office very soon, because most people are not pleased with his performance, and they would, if there were elections held today, he would not win, and then he would face even more charges related to corruption and whatever else he's done that he's been accused of recently. So, when you break it down, and when you look at the overall picture, it's very difficult to say, yes, there should be a release, and it's very difficult to say no, because you have all those families. But are all those families, maybe, or some of them anyway, being used as pawns by people who hate Israel and are promoting all kinds of propaganda against Israel, both from within Israel and externally? And the answer is yes, of course they are. But at the same time, you could say that the people in general are held up and used people who are warmongers and who want the war to go on as long as possible. And the truth is somewhere in the middle. And you could say it's a very clear black and white issue, and no matter what opinion you have, you'll probably see it that way. But if you kind of take a mile-high view of the thing, of the situation, you might see that it contains more gradients than just black and white. It is more complicated than just saying, yes, guys should be destroyed and we should go at them relentlessly. On the one hand, I do agree that deterrence is more powerful than acquiescence. I definitely do. On the other hand, it's hard not to have sympathy for anybody who is held hostage and to do anything possible to get them home, including exchange. And it's hard to not feel bad for their families, too, who are praying and hoping for them to come home ASAP, safe and sound. And even for those who are families of the dead, who wish for their bodies to be returned for proper burial and mourning and everything else. But you have to remember, there are still 2 dead soldiers being held by the Hamas since many years, and they have yet to be returned. And it's been many, many years and a bunch of wars in between, and they still haven't been returned, despite the exchange of 1,000 terrorists for Gilad Shalit, despite numerous attempts at getting them back through diplomatic efforts and everything else. They've not been returned. So, is it worth returning people to their homes, 50 people out of 240 people or so? You're still going to have almost 200 people remaining hostages, and there's no telling how long it will take to get them home, or in what condition they'll arrive. Especially when the Hamas already claims that at least 60 of the hostages have been killed or have died while in captivity. And of course, they blame Israel, but there's no proof, no evidence that that's the case. But obviously, in any case, they're responsible for it because they're the ones who took them hostage. So they were in their hands, therefore they were responsible for their well-being. And at the same time, people who hate Israel will say, well, Israel is killing hundreds of people a day. So what's 50 hostages? Well, it's 50 people that are alive, that have no business being in Gaza, that were taken from their homes without cause, and are being held in the most brutal fashion, subjugated to God knows what at the hands of the Hamas, who disgustingly calls them sometimes guests. They are the furthest thing from guests that you can imagine. Nevertheless, that is their status. They are hostages under the control of the Hamas. And it is very difficult to see why Israel should release 150 prisoners, most of whom, again, have been convicted of terror. Many of whom, if not all, will return to doing such acts in the future when they are getting 50 people in return, and it's going to be harder for Israel to prosecute the war to root out Hamas, which is something I've said from the very beginning. This war will probably end very differently than what the official Israeli line is. So, while I have mixed thoughts or mixed opinions about this in many ways, I actually believe that deterrence is important, and maybe more important. And yet, as a human being, maybe I'm a bit of a bleeding heart liberal on this point. So I feel for the families and for the hostages and want them to return home. And it is a quagmire. It is a very difficult situation. Nevertheless, the overarching big picture, if you can make your heart not so hot-blooded for a moment and feel for, remove the feelings from the issue, you can say intellectually that there's no doubt that deterrence is a stronger factor and should, rule the day. However, that's not the case, because the pause on the war is officially on for 4 days, and we'll see what the future brings. But It is very difficult. It's not an easy situation. And I know there are very good people who believe one way and the other. The problem is, again, that this war was started by violent terrorists. And it will really only end if they surrender or are eliminated, if their control of Gaza is dismantled, and if ultimately their education changes radically, as I mentioned in the previous video. It has a lot to do with that, almost more than anything. It has to do with their future education. Anyway, that's it for now. Take care.